Welcome to Kairos Research Center podcast. Christian faith seeking understanding, intellectual witness, and spiritual renewal.
What are the facts surrounding the resurrection claim?
First one, obviously, Jesus was dead. He was crucified by the soldiers. Second, the disciples did not expect Jesus to die and were not prepared when it happened. Third, because of this, the disciples' frustration and discouragement, it was a contrast to the sudden and abrupt transformation in the confidence and certainty. So there's a contrast between the unexpected death and crucifixion and the confidence and certainty in their preaching. What causes the contrast? According to the records, it was a result of Jesus' appearances. They encountered the resurrected Christ. And talking about the resurrected Christ, of course, we talk about the bodily resurrected Christ. And by implication, the result would be, the fourth fact would be that there is an empty tomb. Fifth fact would be that there is a resurrection faith from unbelief to now belief and confident proclamation of the resurrection. I may include this an additional historical fact, and that is contemporary Judaism had no concept of a dying and rising Messiah. And that's why Jesus' death was unexpected. Still another recorded fact of significance is that the disciples, when they proclaimed the resurrection of Jesus, it was in Jerusalem, near where Jesus was buried, meaning when they preached Jesus was resurrected, they didn't say, oh no, Jesus was buried somewhere in Syria and he has risen alive. If I give you an example, if somebody died here, somewhere in Petaling Jaya, and I claim a few days later he's risen from the dead, they say, yo, he was buried in Ulu Tembeling. You know where's Ulu Tembeling or not? National Park Pahang, huh? Nobody knows one, you know. You can't go there and verify. But you say, but this person was buried in Sea Park, has risen from the dead. You can go there and find out, you know. So the fact that the proclamation of the resurrection was in Jerusalem is of great significance because in principle it could easily be challenged and refuted by the critics. And finally, of course, we cannot avoid the fact that Paul and James, who were unbelievers, hostile to Christianity, were converted because, as they themselves testify or recorded, they have an encounter with the risen Christ. So let me just elaborate on this one point, on the Jerusalem factor, what I call the time and place of the first preaching. Because the disciples proclaimed the resurrection of Christ in Jerusalem itself, in between 7 weeks, 40 days, 7 weeks time frame, you may say that Christianity, whatever they preached on at the time, was in principle open to verification or falsification. It would have been impossible for Christianity to survive and expand in Jerusalem if the body of Jesus was still in the tomb. As somebody puts it, if the tomb had not been empty, such preaching could not have occurred. The body of Jesus could have been produced, and since it is likely that the location of Joseph Arimathea's tomb was well known, since he himself was a respected member of the Sanhedrin, it wouldn't have been very difficult to find where Jesus was buried. Can you imagine? If the disciples said Jesus has risen, everybody know where he was buried. Just go there and excavate the tomb and parade his body in the streets of Jerusalem, and the disciples would have been silenced forever. And so, rightly, Wolfhard Pannenberg, a great German scholar, says, without having a reliable testimony for the emptiness of Jesus' tomb, the early Christian community could not have survived in Jerusalem proclaiming the resurrection of Christ. So, I would say it is also interesting and not surprising, therefore, in many of these preaching, apart from Peter's immediate reference to the tomb of Jesus, empty tomb of Jesus, in contrast to the tomb of David, where his bones would probably be still lying there. Generally, you may want to say, it's also interesting in all the proclamation of the resurrection of Jesus in Jerusalem area, there was no dispute that the tomb was empty. There was no debate. And if there was no debate, then you can conclude that both Peter and his listeners shared the same assumption, and that is that the tomb was empty. That was not in debate. The only thing in debate was what is the significance of the empty tomb. I think that should be taken into account. So one more item I just want to say that is significant in presenting the evidence for the empty tomb, and that is, you read the records, you find that the earliest witnesses to the empty tomb were the women, not men. Now you read about how the men all disappeared in the crucifixion, and but in the New Testament, in the Gospel, the first witnesses were women. Now I can imagine if I were fabricating a story of the resurrection of Christ and I want to insert the witnesses there, the first witness I would have listed would have been Peter, James, and John, because these are important people in the community. But in contrast to that, the women were the witnesses, and according to Jewish legal principles, the testimony would not have been quite admissible as evidence, and yet the Gospel depict women as the first witnesses to the empty tomb, not the apostles. It is so because of that, the genuineness of the record becomes even more credible. And I think, and then one last point I want to say is, for the evidence of the empty tomb, is that there was no veneration of Jesus' tomb. What do I mean by that? In many of this culture, you have a holy man when he gets buried, and the pilgrims will come and pray at the tomb, veneration at the tomb. Presumably, your prayers will be more effectively answered. But surprisingly, even though this was a practice of Jews in ancient times, veneration of holy people, and surprisingly, even though Jesus would have been more than just a holy one, Jesus is the Son of God, according to the believers, there was no incident of early Christians till now venerating the empty tomb of Jesus. You got the tomb of John the baptizer, somewhere in Jerusalem, but you don't have the tomb, the veneration of this tomb in these early times. So, what is the reason for this remarkable absence? Probably, if there was no body in the tomb, there is no reason to go to the tomb to have veneration. So again, it wouldn't be appropriate for a tomb for veneration. So all in all, having listed these few examples, I would say you have what I will call these converging lines of historical evidence. Argument for the empty tomb is indeed compelling, although this does not stop critics from mounting alternative explanations.